Undercover boss orders breakfast at his own café. Stunned when waitress reveals daily hunger. One drizzly morning outside the awning, Michael Carter, CEO of Sunrise Cafe, a coffee chain that had once been his greatest pride, donned an old flannel shirt, a faded baseball cap he had stashed in his closet for years. He hesitated at the glass door, where raindrops streaked down in long trails, like scars on the wall of time. Inside the cafe, the warm yellow light still glowed, reflecting off the misty air like fading memories. Once upon a time, Michael had poured his heart into every corner of the shop, every wooden table, every cup of coffee he poured for his guests. But today, he was no longer the authoritative CEO, no longer the owner with absolute power, but merely an ordinary customer, yearning to understand why the turnover rate on the reports had spiked so dramatically. Those numbers had haunted him for many sleepless nights spent wrestling with guilt that crept in between lines of revenue reports, waiting to celebrate success. He pushed open the glass door, and the chill of the air conditioner hit his face like a reminder. He was stepping back into the place he had built. But the atmosphere here no longer carried the laughter, the warm greetings that had once greeted every morning, replaced now by an uncomfortable silence, interspersed with the occasional clinking of spoons against glasses, sounding lonely and isolated. Michael chose a familiar seat near the bar, where he had once sat listening to staff share small stories about customers, about dreams of buying an old motorbike, or about a fancy vacation that never happened. His eyes drifted across the cafe, taking in the worn metal chairs, the slightly crooked wall art. Everything was still there, but none of it felt whole anymore. Soft footsteps approached. Olivia, the young waitress with slightly disheveled hair and dark circles under her eyes from too little sleep, stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly as she placed a steaming cup of coffee before him. A drop of water clung to her finger, rolled down, and fell onto the table, merging with the steam rising from the cup. Her eyes wandered in the glow of the yellow light, searching for something beyond the meager tip money she received after each shift. Michael met her gaze, his eyes catching a weariness mixed with a deep sorrow. She let out a sigh, so soft it almost blended into the sound of rain outside, yet just loud enough for Michael to hear, just sharp enough to pierce his heart like a cold knife. We often skip breakfast just so we can keep working. The coffee in Michael's hand suddenly tasted bitter. He looked at Olivia, her eyes weary, yet holding a quiet resilience that only those who had endured the longest days could understand. A business he had once built with all his pride, once celebrated as the kindest place in the city, had now become a place where even his own staff had to skip breakfast to have the strength to serve customers. Michael fell silent. Outside, the drizzle still fell, but within him, a greater storm was brewing, shattering every beautiful illusion. In that moment, he knew. He could no longer sit in the CEO's chair pretending not to know. Sunrise Cafe, the place he had once proudly called his second home, had become a gilded cage where small people had to sacrifice their own breakfasts just to keep serving guests. And in that very moment, Michael realized that Olivia's eyes weren't just the tired look of a waitress, they were a mirror reflecting the harsh reality he had to face. A twist he had never dared to imagine. Sunrise Cafe had lost the very soul of kindness he once protected, and he was the only one who could do something to reclaim it. Michael Carter, CEO of Sunrise Cafe, had once proudly called this place his second home, where every cup of coffee wasn't just a drink but a bridge for everyday stories, for relationships nurtured through every look and every smile. He remembered those first mornings of opening, the warm yellow light reflecting off the wooden floor, the sound of the doorbell jingling every time a customer walked in, and the staff's hands deftly preparing drinks, smiles always bright on their faces. But this morning, everything seemed to have changed. A light rain draped a misty veil over the shop's awning, raindrops sliding down the glass like the meandering thoughts in his own mind. The yellow light still shone, casting its glow on the worn metal chairs and the crookedly hung paintings, but the atmosphere had grown so cold it made him shiver. He stepped into the cafe in his old flannel shirt and faded baseball cap, no longer the powerful CEO but just a quiet customer, eyes sweeping over the empty tables, a few staff members cleaning up, their bodies hunched over as if bracing themselves against something invisible. The sound of spoons clinking against glasses felt faint and alien, like a funeral bell announcing the collapse of something he once thought was unshakable. At the bar, the POS screen glowed a dull green, looking more like an unfeeling machine than the helpful assistant of the shop. Michael's eyes drifted to that screen, recalling the time he approved the new system with a naive trust in technology, believing it would make everything better, more transparent. But now, in the suffocating air, that modern tool radiated an eerie coldness. The cold numbers in the reports arriving at headquarters in recent weeks felt like nails driven into his chest every night. The turnover rate spiking, revenue dropping, customer complaints about service attitude. And then, on a stormy night, he realized he could no longer sit in his comfortable executive office, staring at dry graphs to understand how the heart of Sunrise Cafe was really beating. That night, he decided to return to the place he had once considered his second home, to listen to the shop's every breath, to look into the eyes of those who had built Sunrise Cafe with him from day one, and to find out what had turned this place into such a cold and lifeless home. Michael shuddered as a gust of wind rattled through the crack in the door, bringing the chill of the rain. The yellow light cast strong but weary lines across his face. He wondered, was it still possible for him to patch up the cracks that were spreading across Sunrise Cafe, or was it already too late? Then, he took a deep breath, lightly brushing his faded cap, his eyes shining with a determination he had never felt before. Whatever the outcome, he knew he had to face it because Sunrise Cafe wasn't just a coffee shop, it was a promise to himself and to those who tirelessly work behind the bar every day. Michael walked slowly between the empty rows of tables and chairs, his hand lightly touching the back of a chair, the same chair that not long ago had still been warm with the laughter and greetings of regular customers. Now it was as cold as the lifeless reports he read every night, full of nothing but numbers and devoid of human warmth. The yellow light, once a sign of warmth, now felt like a layer of makeup trying to cover up the cafe's fatigue. He glanced up at the light bulbs, noticing some had dulled or flickered, as if they too were tired of illuminating a place that was gradually losing its soul. The clinking sound of a cup hitting a saucer from the bar counter startled him, yanking him back to reality. A young, timid-looking employee was wiping down a table near the window, his eyes fixed on the rag in his hand, avoiding everyone's gaze. Michael remembered the eager look on the boy's face during the interview, when he said he wanted to learn from even the smallest things, to be part of a family, and now he looked like he was enduring the grind of an invisible heavy machine. The achievement board on the wall, once the pride of the cafe, now gathered dust, its certificates yellowed and frayed at the edges. Michael reached out to lightly brush the dust away, his eyes lingering on the words of praise that had once made him hold his head high. Best cafe service in the city, where employees are treated like family now. They felt like old promises that even he wasn't sure he still believed. A waitress passed by with a tray full of cups, her steps quick but her eyes vacant, no longer sparkling with the enthusiasm Michael had seen in her eyes on the first day she applied for the job. He suddenly realized the light he'd once been so proud of had dimmed. It had been replaced by numbers, plans, and long-winded reports, ultimately becoming a burden that people like her had to bear. Michael stopped at the bar counter, his gaze falling on the wall calendar, its page for today folded at the corner, like the tired breath of this cafe. He reached out and smoothed it with his finger, a streak of dust sticking to his hand. In that moment, he realized he could no longer be the person who stood above, judging by email threads and reports. He looked up, his heart tightening. His cafe was still here, with the same wooden frames and the rich aroma of roasted coffee, but its soul was lost among the cold porcelain cups and the feeble yellow light. Sunrise Cafe, the place where he'd once poured his youth and dreams, had become an empty shell, filled only with the intermittent sounds of a time that had passed. Michael clenched his hand around his old flannel shirt, the only thing that still reminded him of the early days of his startup, and told himself, whatever happens, he would find out why this place was withering away. Not just to save revenue, but to save something more precious, the trust he'd promised to those who once called this place home. Michael sat quietly at the bar, the cold iron seat pressing through his worn-out clothes. He set his faded baseball cap aside, turning the paper coffee cup in his hand, like he was trying to find a familiar rhythm. His eyes scanned every corner of the cafe, the corners where paint was peeling, the flickering yellow light struggling to hold on to its last bit of warmth, and the wooden tables with scratches like old memories. In front of him, a small cake was neatly placed on a porcelain plate, its warm aroma wafting like a gentle reminder of the old days when Michael used to believe that every cake, every cup of coffee carried the affection of the entire cafe for its guests. But this morning, even the fragrant aroma couldn't dispel the cold emptiness in his heart. The sound of footsteps echoed softly in the stillness. A Olivia, the young waitress, with tousled hair and dark circles under her eyes from many long nights of overtime, bowed her head slightly as she placed a steaming cup of coffee in front of Michael. Her hands trembled, leaving a drop of water clinging to the edge of the cup before it slid down to the table like a lonely dewdrop in the drizzly morning. Michael looked up at Olivia, his eyes meeting her eyes that held a resilience mixed with a despair he'd never seen during her early days at the cafe. Back then, Olivia had been a small, bright-eyed girl, her hands quick and sure as she prepared coffee. Now she stood before him as a living testament to something that had been lost, the kindness that Sunrise Cafe had once promised to preserve. In that moment, Olivia sighed, her breath dissolving into the damp air like the cafe's own weary exhalation. Her voice trembled, so soft only he could hear. "I have to skip breakfast just to get here to work. Tips aren't even enough to pay the rent anymore." Her whispered words were like a cold knife straight into Michael's heart. The steaming coffee in his hand suddenly tasted bitter, its once inviting aroma now a harsh reminder of injustice. He shivered slightly, the yellow light from above, casting shadows that accentuated the deep lines on his face. His eyes glanced over the empty iron chairs, the scattered order slips on the register counter, the stray tip notes like teardrops that still remained. Michael felt acutely that Sunrise Cafe place he'd once considered his second home now seemed to be drawing its final breath. A part of Sunrise Cafe's soul was being strangled right before his eyes, and Michael knew. This was no longer about numbers on a report or business strategies. This was a moment when he, the man who had once proudly called this place family, had to stand up and fight for the breath of life that those who trusted him still held on to. Michael sat motionless, his hand still gripping the paper coffee cup, as if the lingering warmth might help him fend off the cold creeping into his heart. The steam rose in fragile spirals, then quickly dissipated like the trust he had once had in a Sunrise Cafe filled with love and warmth. A click of a pen cap sounded from the register counter. Michael caught sight of Lucas, the young cashier, hurriedly adjusting a receipt, his hand trembling as he typed, his eyes wide with panic as if he were hiding something. Lucas glanced around the counter. His fearful eyes met Michael's for a fleeting moment before quickly looking down. Michael looked at Lucas, then turned his gaze to Olivia, who was clearing dirty dishes from a table in the corner of the cafe. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment, and, in that moment, Michael read an entire untold story. A story of endless hours of hard work, of late-night shifts stretching into the night, of the meager tips being whittled away by the cold numbers in the POS system he had once trusted completely. Outside the window, the rain still fell steadily, but it no longer felt comforting. Each drop was like a reminder. He had left the cafe behind for too long, letting the reports obscure the faces he once called family. Outside the glass, motorcycles zipped past, leaving long streaks of water in their wake. Michael saw his reflection in the glass of frame slightly thinner, eyes heavy with weariness. He suddenly felt like a stranger in his own cafe, a lonely man, powerless in the face of a painful truth. The people keeping this cafe alive were also the ones being hurt the most. The yellow light shone down on the bar, where Olivia had just placed a tray of cups. She quickly wiped a raindrop from her shoulder, her breath forming thin wisps of fog. In that moment, she turned to look at Michael. Her eyes seemed to hold a question. "Do you still see us? Do you still believe in the promise you once made?" Michael felt his heart pound. He knew this moment was not just Olivia's lament or Lucas's fearful glance. It was a cry for help from Sunrise Cafe, a plea that he's the founder, as the leader, as the one who had once promised to protect every employee could not ignore. He looked up, his eyes locking with Olivia's, and he nodded gently, a silent promise. In that moment, Michael knew. Everything had changed. This was no longer just about tips or profits. It was about people, the very people who had built the Sunrise Cafe brand, and he would have to be the first to stand up and fight for justice for them. The yellow light, once a dull glow on a rainy morning, now seemed to shine brighter, illuminating the determination in his eyes. Michael closed his eyes for a second, took a deep breath, then released the cup from his hand. The last warmth dissipated, leaving behind a chill that was also the fuel for his resolve to act. Michael sat quietly at the bar, his eyes following every step the employees took, as if each step could reveal to him things the reports never had. The yellow light reflected off the tiled floor, revealing a few employees near the POS counter, their laughter light but leaving a bitter aftertaste in him of something not right. He noticed that some people seemed to be favored in the tips distribution. They looked relaxed, confident, even a bit smug in a way he had never seen during the cafe's early days. They moved with a casual ease, occasionally laughing and chatting with the shift manager like old colleagues. Meanwhile, in a dim corner, Olivia was bent over cleaning a table, her posture hunched, as if trying to shrink herself to avoid the gaze of those with more power. Michael squinted slightly toward the faint blue light of the POS screen at the cashier counter, a tool he had once believed would bring transparency and fairness to all his employees. But now, the light from it felt cold and unfeeling. He caught sight of Lucas operating the screen, his hands moving quickly as if hiding something. A receipt was printed, and Lucas hastily flipped it, his eyes darting around before shoving it into the drawer. Michael's heart tightened. In a fleeting moment, he saw himself approving this POS system back. Then he had believed that technology would be a powerful ally to uphold the values Sunrise Cafe stood for. Now, that very technology had become an invisible knife, slicing into the trust of those who had been by his side all these years. His eyes shifted to Olivia, her face held a hint of sadness, her hands gathering the dirty cups with a determination that was heartbreaking. Michael knew well that she had been assigned the least busy shifts, the hours where tips amounted to nothing but a few coins, barely enough for a decent breakfast. Meanwhile, those who were favored always had the peak hours where tips overflowed and laughter was abundant. He clenched his hand around the now cold paper cup. Every distant laugh at the bar now seemed to emphasize the bitterness even more. A system he had once completely trusted was now pushing the kind-hearted people into the shadows. Michael felt anger welling up inside him. Every number in the reports he had once read with the belief that it reflected the growth of Sunrise Cafe now felt like nothing more than a veil concealing injustice. It had blinded him, made him forget that the real smiles of his employees were the true measure of Sunrise Cafe's worth, the very value he had sworn to protect. In the yellow light, Michael realized fairness was being stolen right in the very home he had poured his sweat and tears into building. And Heather, one in charge, had to take responsibility for these injustices if he still wanted to save the soul of Sunrise Cafe. Content value. This story is not just a revenue report or a dry set of numbers. It's a reminder of a leader's responsibility to always listen, to always stand by the people who quietly dedicate themselves. Sunrise Cafe would no longer be Sunrise Cafe if injustice were allowed to take root. Michael took a deep breath, his eyes glancing toward the glass door, where the raindrops continued to fall steadily, forming long streaks. Outside, the pale yellow streetlights cast their glow on the glass, reflecting his own Imaja tired figure, eyes pensive. In a brief moment, he saw two images overlapping. Michael Carter in the early days of the cafe, full of confidence and hope, and Michael Carter no heavy with unanswered questions. A faint laugh from the bar reached his ears, pulling Michael back to the present. A group of young employees sat close together, their eyes gleaming as they looked at the POS screen, occasionally exchanging knowing glances. Michael leaned to observe, catching one employee quickly, making adjustments on the screen, a self-satisfied look on their face, as if they were wielding an invisible power. He furrowed his brow slightly. The POS system, in which he had once placed absolute trust for its transparency, now suddenly seemed more suspicious than ever. The faint blue light from the screen shone on that employee's face, making him look like a completely different person compared to the eager face from the day he was first hired. A sigh escaped from Michael's own chest. He turned his head to look around the cafe, where Olivia was still patiently wiping down tables, her hair wet from the rain and sticking together in clumps. A drop of water fell onto her shoulder, soaking into the fabric as a sign that she had exhausted all her strength. Michael saw her hands tremble slightly as she pushed aside a few tips from a customer's table, those few tips that he knew were not enough to pay for her rent, utilities, and food for the next day. He suddenly remembered a late night a few months ago when Olivia had timidly asked him about getting more hours to earn extra income. At that time, he had smiled and said that everything would soon get better, that Sunrise Cafe was growing, and that she just needed to be patient. But now, seeing her hustling through the least busy shifts, her eyes shadowed with a resigned sadness, Michael wondered whether he himself was a part of the injustice she was enduring. The rain outside fell harder, as if trying to soothe the suffocating air that surrounded him. Michael closed his eyes for a moment, and in his mind, images of every employee played out, those people who had once placed their trust in him, who had once called Sunrise Cafe their family. Now, those images had shattered into fragments. An employee afraid every time they were assigned a shift, Another worried every time the POS reported a tip error, an older employee calculating how to save enough for breakfast for the week. Michael opened his eyes, the cafe's yellow light highlighting the tired lines and somber furrows on his forehead. He saw more clearly than ever. Sunrise Cafe was losing the warm light it once had, not because of falling revenue numbers, but because the very people there had lost their faith in fairness. In that moment, Michael heard the beating of his own heart, a sound he had long neglected amid the relentless grind of profit and dry reports. He knew he could no longer sit still, letting the cold numbers weigh down the people who had already carried so many burdens on their shoulders. A CEO, he told himself, doesn't just have the responsibility to manage and grow, but must also look into the eyes of each employee to see the sweat, the tears, and sometimes the blood of the trust they have invested in Sunrise Cafe. And Michael knew, if he didn't have the courage to face it, he would never again deserve to sit in the CEO's chair of the very dream he had built. Michael stood up, the sound of the metal chair scraping on the tiled floor echoing awkwardly through the bustling cafe. The clinking of spoons against plates suddenly fell silent, leaving behind a tension as taut as a string about to snap. The yellow light shone on his face, highlighting the deep lines etched by many sleepless nights. He removed his worn-out baseball cap, placing it on the bar as a silent declaration. Today, he was no longer an anonymous customer. He was Michael Carter, CEO of Sunrise Cafe, the founder of this very place. His voice rang out deep yet resolute, cutting through every curious and uneasy gaze. I am Michael Carter, the one who built Sunrise Cafe from nothing. A ripple of commotion swept through the entire cafe, from the guest tables to the long benches. The shift manager stood frozen, his expression shifting before immediately dropping, his hands gripping a stack of receipts as if clinging to something to hide his trembling. Michael took a deep breath and pulled a stack of papers from the pocket of his jacket's receipts with tampered tips, skewed shift schedules, copies of messages containing veiled threats. He held them high, his voice sharp as a blade cutting through the stifling air. This is the evidence of what you've done. Receipts with blatantly altered tips, unfairly arranged work shifts, and promises of transparency that have now become an empty shell. A breathless silence fell over the entire cafe. The staff standing behind the bar glanced at one another, their eyes meeting in anxiety and hope. Michael pointed straight at the shift manager, his voice cold as the midnight rain outside. I trusted you. I believed that this system would bring fairness to all employees, so everyone would be paid fairly for their work. But you betrayed that trust. The shift manager hung his head, his shoulders trembling like a rain-soaked branch. His eyes darkened as he realized he had no way out. Michael took another deep breath and turned to the staff gathered behind the bar. His gaze softened but still burned with determination. I'm sorry for letting this happen. I'm sorry that I let cold numbers overshadow the eyes and smiles of those who made Sunrise Cafe what it is. He paused for a beat, letting the weight of each word sink in. Then he looked at Olivia, the girl who still stood silently by the tray, her hands trembling but her eyes shining like a flame rekindled after days of ashes. I'm declaring right now, those involved will be immediately dismissed. And starting today, every tips receipt will be verified transparently in the presence of all staff. A round of applause rose from the back of the cafe, then spread like a flame carried by the rain. Olivia placed a hand over her heart, tears welling in her eyes, her gaze at Michael sparkling with trust. For the first time in days, she saw the light of justice. Content value. The image of a CEO who is not perfect but dares to stand up and face mistakes, dares to correct wrongs to protect his employees. This is the deepest leadership lesson. Not every CEO is perfect, but a true leader is one who is willing to take responsibility to restore the human values upon which the business was built. A sudden gust of wind swept through the glass doors, causing the menu board on the wall to sway gently. Michael stood there, his hands still gripping the stack of papers, undeniable proof of betrayal. His eyes met the faces of each staff member, those who had once believed in the dream of Sunrise Cafe, those who had once called this place home. A sigh escaped from a corner of the cafe, sounding like a confession from the entire room. A young employee, Lucas, emerged from behind the counter, his hands still dusted with flour, his eyes wide with worry, his face pale. He stammered, "Boss, I didn't know things had gotten this bad." Michael looked straight at Lucas, his voice dropping but still firm and resolute. "Lucas, this isn't just about the numbers. This is about trust, about fairness, about how we treat each other in a family. A halting breath echoed. Olivia stood nearby, gripping a cleaning cloth so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Tears welled up in her eyes, but they shone brighter than ever. She raised her head, her voice trembling. "Thank you for saying what all of us have been too afraid to." Michael nodded, his gaze softening yet still steely. He turned to the manager, his voice ringing out like thunder amid the rain. "I don't need people who just manipulate the system for their own gain. Sunrise Cafe has no place for those who betray their coworkers." The air in the cafe seemed to freeze. An older employee, someone who had been with the cafe since the beginning, quietly stepped away from the corner of the bar, his eyes glinting with a faint hope. He stood tall, nodded at Michael, then softly said, "Sunrise Cafe will come back, and it will be stronger." Michael placed his hand on the bar, the cold wood beneath his palm making him shiver, a reminder that Sunrise Cafe had once been his warmest dream, and now that dream was teetering on the edge of collapse. He cast his eyes around the Remevery face, waiting for him to make the final decision. And Michael knew this moment would define his character as a leader. He drew a deep breath, his voice ringing out sharp yet filled with deep humanity. "I will personally oversee the tips distribution and shift assignments starting today. Every employee has the right to fairness, to respect, and I swear I will never let Sunrise Cafe become a shadow of itself ever again." And a round of applause rose from the corner of the room, echoing like a ray of light breaking through the rain outside. In that moment, Michael knew. He had begun to win back the most precious thing, the trust of the people who had once placed their dreams in this place. The rain had eased, leaving behind pale sunlight streaming through the window, casting interwoven beams across the tiled floor. The air in the cafe seemed to awaken after a long storm. Olivia stood tall behind the counter, a new name tag gleaming on her chest. Olivia, shift manager. She guided a new employee on how to use the new POS system this time, every figure displayed clearly, transparently down to the last cent of tips. The green light on the screen shone on her face, no longer the cold glow of the old days, but reflecting a newfound confidence, a resilience forged through countless sleepless nights. Michael stood by the counter, his hands tucked into his coat pockets, his eyes reflecting a rare sense of peace. The new POS system, transparent and fair, was now living proof of his commitment, that every effort made by the staff deserved to be respected. A group of regular customers walked in, and the sound of the door chime rang out like the overture to a new day. Olivia greeted them with a smile, her voice confident, her eyes sparkling brightly. In that moment, Michael knew that Sunrise Cafe had rediscovered the warmth he had always dreamed of. He stepped back, his gaze sweeping over the achievement boards now free of dust, the wooden tables now neatly arranged, the lively, warm laughter of the staff echoing through the space. The yellow light still shone in no longer a forced glow, but the light of hope, of dreams built from the purest of intentions. Michael nodded gently, his heart lighter than ever before. He realized that the success of a business did not lie solely in framed revenue reports hanging on the walls. It lay in the confident eyes and smiles of the people who had made Sunrise Cafe their second home, people whom he had the responsibility to care for and protect. In the gentle sunlight emerging after the rain, Michael knew every mistake could be corrected if met with enough courage and sincerity. And from the moment he had dared to stand up and admit his mistakes, Sunrise Cafe had been reborn not just as a coffee shop, but as a family. The story reminds us that justice is not something distant, nor is it a slogan on a wall. It is present in the way a CEO knows how to put the right people in the right place, and most importantly, dares to make amends when necessary. That is the deepest lesson in leadership, a lesson in courage, kindness, and responsibility to those who have placed their trust in you.